And okay, if we just took this Great Minds Salon, it's like adult education gone wild because we are learning so much. But also, Billy, I want to thank you for being here and for having a mom who's been so warm and welcoming to me. It was great to meet you, and I can't wait to learn what Bitcoin is, since I think all the younger people know it, and we can be now hip because we're going to know what Bitcoin is. Thank you for making us all lifelong learners, Ellen.
So just a little bit of housekeeping. We will leave some time at the end of Billy's presentation for questions. What I ask you to do is put them in the chat to me, and at the Q&A, I will submit the questions to him. It's my pleasure to introduce Billy. Billy is the Manager of Business Development and Partnerships at the Stellar Development Foundation, an organization which seeks to create equitable access to the global financial system. In his role, he works on developing Stellar Network's global reach and forming partnerships with financial institutions and digital asset issuers. Prior to joining SDF, Billy worked as a management consultant at PC, focused on enabling his clients.
Ellen, I think we lost you. You're
Somebody
muted.
has to unmute. Somebody muted.
Somebody keeps muting me. My husband does that all the time. I didn't expect it to. No. Prior to Billy holds 2 engineering degrees from the University of Michigan, and
Oh man, we're being Zoom bombed here. Somebody muted you again.
So if Roberta and Moshe, because you are co-chairs, or Billy, if you can just watch it and then unmute her.
Okay.
I'll keep an eye on it. Where was I? Did I say go blue yet?
No.
No.
You can always say that again.
Okay. So Billy holds 2 engineering degrees from the University.
You're muted again.
I don't know who's doing it because I
And
wasn't
an
even touching the
MBA
computer.
from Cornell Tech. He wrote his website, Billy Bitcoin, to help bring Bitcoin and blockchain understanding to a broader audience. Billy is the son of members Linda and Michael Grenis, and I always like to claim when it's been a former student of mine, and Billy was a student of mine in the religious school a while back. So Billy, welcome. We are all looking forward to learning about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and I turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ellen, for setting this up and the introduction, and to everybody who is here tonight. I want to say thank you to Sue Carnegie for moving out of the screen because she's wearing an Ohio State sweatshirt, which we're not a fan of. But everybody else, thank you for joining, and I'm really excited to give my presentation. So Ellen gave a great overview of who I am and what I'm doing, but I do want to give a little bit of a background on my journey with Bitcoin, blockchain, cryptocurrency, because I think it'll give a good context as to how this presentation came to be. So in 2013, probably, I remember starting to hear about this thing, Bitcoin, and I'm a very tech forward person. I think of myself as a tech conscious person amongst my friends. And so I said, I need to be a part of this thing that's Bitcoin. And I remember at the time I was texting my brother, who unfortunately didn't take the same plunge that I did. But he was the one that, kind of was chatting with me back and forth and convinced me to buy Bitcoin. And I remember when we were discussing it, the reason we wanted to buy, I bought it so quickly is because I wanted to buy it before there was an ETF that was launched. And the Winklevi twins were trying to pass get an ETF pass tracking Bitcoin. And we thought it was imminent. So I had to buy then. Of course, 8, 9 years later, there's still no Bitcoin ETF. So luckily I got involved, but I got involved in Bitcoin before I even knew how it worked. But shortly after, while I was at PwC, teaching about emerging technologies to partners and clients, blockchain was one of those technologies that I would always get questions and I didn't have answers. And so I'm not someone who likes to not have answers. So I decided I needed to learn. And so I went down the rabbit hole of learning how Bitcoin works, how blockchain works. And so a lot of this presentation comes from my website, which I wrote and will share with everyone, trying to bring Bitcoin and blockchain to as many people as possible, because I want everybody to understand it and understand why it's such a great combination of technologies, and hopefully will result in some great innovation. So I need to share my screen. Ellen, can everyone see this?
I can see it, so I'm assuming everybody else can.
Perfect. Okay, great. So I gave you an overview of my history with Bitcoin, and as I said, I just kind of got involved and bought it because I had heard of it, and then subsequently wanted to understand the technology better. So I do want to briefly go into some of the thought behind, why Bitcoin came to be, and some of the reasons that it exists. And then I'll go more into how it actually works. And then you can go from there and decide, what you want to learn more about, or if you think this technology will be important. So advancements in technology have made it so that information can be shared instantly with anyone in the world, regardless of where it came from. I mean, look at us right now. We're video chatting. I'm in Palm Beach, Florida. I think there's people all over the country and in Princeton, New Jersey joining this. I could also send an email right now to somebody halfway across the world, to somebody in Japan. And it doesn't matter, right? The internet has enabled us to be able to send data and information across the web instantly. That being said, the same isn't true for money or other things of value. And this challenge lies with what's called the double spend problem. So while I can send an email to a friend, and then that same email can be sent to 5 other people, the same doesn't work for money. If I sent you a digital money and you were able to send it to somebody else and turn around and give it to somebody else, that doesn't work, right? Because money isn't meant to be duplicated and replicated. So if I were to hand you a single dollar bill and hand that to you, and you took it, and now I no longer had it, you would know I paid you. But there's no way to replicate that on the internet. Well, actually, there is a way to replicate that on the internet, and that's our existing financial institution. It's banks and our existing financial infrastructure. Banks, other financial institutions have built all of these systems in place to manage our money for us, to prevent this double spend problem and enable us to move money over the internet or digitally. That being said, this data now is in the hands of single entities and central authorities that kind of has authority over how this money moves. So also these databases from one organization, from one bank to the next within the US or across various countries are often not interoperable or don't communicate. This leads to a financial system with large delays when money has to be moved from one place to another. If you've ever tried to send money to a friend or family abroad who uses a different currency, while it may show up as sent, it'll actually take days to settle those payments. And as your payment flows through the several intermediaries, each one is taking a cut, and you'll have to pay a hefty fee for it to eventually arrive. And that is even if those people have bank accounts. the traditional financial system, as a result of kind of this disconnectedness, is very costly and excludes billions of people today who are not able to access financial services as we know it. And so it goes beyond that as well. With we saw in 2008 and 2009 the mismanagement by banks leading to a financial crash. We're seeing today high inflation across the globe, which Americans are used to a stable dollar, but today 7% inflation was just announced as the highest inflation, I think, in over 30 years. And so this is what happens when you trust people to handle money and flows. And the US is lucky. Countries like Zimbabwe, Venezuela, they're dealing with hyperinflation, where the value of their money can lose half its value in a year or even overnight. So in 2009, an anonymous entity going by the name Satoshi Nakamoto invented Bitcoin to solve that problem. And Bitcoin, which is where I always start all of my education about blockchain, because it was the first blockchain, is the answer to solve this problem. So in the same way that the internet democratized access to information, blockchain can democratize access to the financial system. And hopefully it can make sending value around the world as easy as sending an email. So what blockchain did, or Bitcoin did, was it, instead of trusting one party, relied on a network of parties, which anybody could join this network or leave this network as they please, to help validate transactions and enable the movement of the flow of money, which is Bitcoin, without trusting a single authority. Now, Bitcoin and blockchain is no different than what you're looking at here. This is just a ledger of transactions. And in its simplest form, that's all that blockchain is a ledger of transactions. But this ledger instead is managed by a number of entities instead of one. So put most simply, blockchain is a way to move value without trusting a single centralized entity. Now let's explore how that actually happens. So as I mentioned before, I always start with Bitcoin because the term blockchain actually came from the Bitcoin white paper and had never been heard of before Bitcoin was released in 2009. And this Billy Bitcoin is the name of my website, and I guess persona as well, where I go into detail about how Bitcoin and blockchain works. And this presentation takes a lot of the assets from that document, but I recommend that anybody that enjoyed this eventually go to my website to learn more. And of course, I must note, this is not investment advice. These are all speculative assets, and you can do what you please. But I do believe very strongly that Bitcoin is here to stay, and in the long run, I'm optimistic of where Bitcoin is going. So to start, we're going to actually start with a term called hashing. And what is hashing? Well, hashing, or a hash function, is a function that can turn any piece of data into. Is that my Uncle Steve causing problems right now? Anyways, a hash function is a way to turn any piece of information or data of arbitrary size into data of fixed size. So here you're looking at Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the first edition. And you probably have all heard of the ISBN hash function, which is that number on the back of every single book, which enables booksellers, libraries, wholesalers, distributors to identify this exact version of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Whether or not it's the hard copy or the soft copy, the year that it was distributed, the language, the exact edition. And this is used to help make booksellers and the jobs of librarians, et cetera, easier. Another type of hash function is the zip code hash function, which was created maybe in the 50s, I don't know, maybe somebody else knows, a long time ago. And the idea was to help make mail zip along or move faster. And so ZIP actually stands for Zone Improvement Plan, but it was definitely a play on the words of mail zipping along. But if you think about when you write a letter, handwriting can be messy and people, write letters differently. But by standardizing city and state into just one 5-digit number, and it actually got extended later to be more specific, you're able to kind of simplify the movement of mail across different cities. And so in the end, hashes are all about data integrity, converting one thing that's arbitrary in length and size and complicated and converting it into something that is a standardized length. So now we're going to talk about a special type of hash function known as a cryptographic hash function. And now you're looking at what I call the Scrabble hash function. And I think most of you on the Zoom have played Scrabble before, and you know how to do the hash function, whether you know it or not. And that is taking a word, in this case, cactus, and adding up the tiles, which is the rules, the hashing rules. And in the end, you result in a hash of a standard length, which is 10. So this is the first rule or the first property of cryptographic hash functions. It's easy to calculate a particular hash for any given data, and that same data will always result in the same hash. So if you look at cactus, it doesn't matter how you add up those numbers. It doesn't matter how many times you try to do it. Cactus is cactus, which will always be worth 10 points. Now, what if on the other hand, I went to you and I said, I'm thinking of a word that starts or that's worth 10 points. Now, even if you had a dictionary with every word in the English language, it would be impossible for you to know which word I'm thinking about. And that's property 2 of cryptographic hash functions. It's impossible to take a hash and figure out what the original data was. Now, property 3, Scrabble doesn't quite have this property, that it's very, very unlikely that any 2 pieces of data will have the same hash. And that's because there's plenty of words in the English language that will add up to 10. But imagine we have a special board we're playing with as well, where every spot on this board, the Scrabble board, had a special square. And instead of these special squares being simple, they were more complex, like multiply word by 3.5, add 12.1 to the word. If you place any word like cactus on these set of squares, and you place any other word, even if it's worth 10 points on its own, on another set of squares, it is very, very unlikely that those different pieces of data will result in the same number or output hash. So most computer hash functions are not board games, but they're algorithms, a set of rules that tells a computer how to convert a piece of data into a string of characters. There are many kinds of these algorithms, but the one we're interested in is called SHA-256, or Secure Hashing Algorithm 256. And as I wrote here, this instructs a computer to use a convoluted series of simple steps and turn any piece of information of any size into a string of 256 ones and zeros. Now, it's important to remember that everything on a computer is represented as ones and zeros. And so this algorithm will take any of those ones and zeros and convert it into a standardized set of 256 ones and zeros. So if you type in my name, Billy, into a computer, you're going to get this hash output, which is 100010, and I'm not going to read all 256. And so the SHA-256 could take my name, Billy. It could take a picture of a cactus. It could take a video of Game of Thrones. it can convert anything digital, anything on a computer to 256 ones and zeros. Now, an important piece of information I want to share, just because we're going to be going back and forth between these, is there's binary and there's hexadecimal. So binary is how you see my name right there, 100, and binary is representing SHA-256 in ones and zeros. And hexadecimal is a way that it's more readable for the human eye, where you convert every 4 digits, every 4 ones and zeros into a letter or number, 0 through 9, A through F. So where it says Billy, and then there's all those ones and zeros, the letters below hexadecimal are saying the exact same thing, just written in a different format. And I left this chart in here just so you could see. So 4 zeros equals 0, all ones equals F. So every time here, there's an 8 at the beginning, and I have 1000 is the first 4 digits, and that's 8. Oh, I forgot to ask. I wanted to give a Bitcoin reward to anyone who spoke up and got it, but maybe somebody who didn't see. How many possibilities are there? So how many different hash possibilities are there in SHA-256? Remember, there's 256 digits, and each one can be a 1 or a 0. Does anyone know? I want to unmute. Nobody's brave enough.
2 to the 256 power.
There we go. I didn't see who that was, but congratulations. You got it. So 2 to the 256. And how big is 2 to the 256? It's big. So this means that 2 to the 256 is 1.16 times 10 to the 77. And that is 5 billion times bigger than the number of atoms in our galaxy, and many, many times bigger than the number of grains of sand or gallons of water on Earth. So we're talking about an infinite number of possible inputs. Remember, any word, file, number, anything can go into SHA-256. And for practical purposes, we're talking about an infinite number of outputs, because there's more possibilities than atoms in our galaxy. So there's one more property that I want to share, and this is property 4, which is even small changes to the input data result in dramatic changes to the output. So I use my name as an example, and the idea here is that there's no patterns. If I give you the hash of BILL, which is E517 and so on, there's no way for you to possibly figure out what the hash of Billy would be without actually converting Billy. So there's no patterns here, and that's an important concept that we will get back to in a little bit. So yeah, just showing here how different B and Billy are with no patterns connecting them. For fun, I wanted to show what the Jewish Center, the hash of the Jewish Center would be. So maybe you could put that up on the website and say, here's our hash. So you may be saying, okay, we came here to learn about Bitcoin or blockchain, cryptocurrency. You're talking about hashing and zip codes and Harry Potter, but what does this have to do with Bitcoin? So we're going to take a brief detour here, and I just want to bring up the term miner. And I think a lot of people probably have heard the term miner when it comes to Bitcoin, or the term of Bitcoin mining. And so what a Bitcoin miner is doing is aggregating transactions. So if I'm using Bitcoin and I'm sending money to Daniel in this case, a miner is someone who's going to pick up that transaction and place that transaction in a block. So here you see block N. I paid Daniel, my mother paid Ray, my father paid Ira, and this miner, which is actually a computer, most likely running software, is aggregating transactions and arranging them in a block. So the next thing this miner does is it takes all of these transactions from that, puts them in a block, and then runs SHA-256, the algorithm we were just talking about, over that whole block. And remember, you can put SHA-256 over a block of transactions because these block of transactions are just, it's just data on a computer. And so in this case, we have these 3 transactions on block N. We run it through SHA-256, and here we have the resulting output hash. So here we show you 2 blocks, and there's actually another piece of data that goes on each block. So the miner is aggregating transactions on a block, and there's actually one more thing. They're putting the hash of the previous block in the next block. So you see, this is block M, but it actually possesses block L's hash in it. And then now we're trying to solve block N, and we're using the hash of block N. So what this does is it creates a chain of blocks, or a blockchain, because each block contains the hash of the block before it. And remember, every input results in a unique output of a hash. So that hash essentially represents every transaction that has occurred prior to it. Because if I were to change one transaction on block L, that would change the hash here, the resulting hash, which would change block M, which would change this, and the network would automatically realize somebody is messing with the data. So when you hear the term blockchain, it's really just a set of connected transaction sets which are put into blocks, which all kind of tie back to each other by this unique hashing algorithm. So miners are creating these transactions, or not creating the transactions, but aggregating the transactions that are submitting to the network, arranging them into blocks, and saying they're okay. But like, why, remember this, there's no centralized authority. So why are all of the miners on the network going to agree to this block? And so who decides to create the next block? Well, there's actually one more piece to each block, which I left off, and that's what a term called a nonce. Now, to win a Bitcoin block or to produce the next block, the hash that you have output actually has to start with a certain number of zeros. So remember, you put in data into SHA-256, you have no idea what the resulting output would be. So there's no way to predict that the resulting hash will have a certain number of zeros at the beginning. And so what you actually do is as a miner, you're adding up a number, going through iterations of this number called a nonce to ultimately result in a output hash that has a certain number of zeros. So here, to win this block, the miner, he in this case went through 4202 as the nonce, then 4203, 4204, counted up until they got to 59518, and finally found a hash output that had 4 zeros. Now, in this case, this example, you only needed to have 4 hexadecimal zeros to win the block, which is actually 16 zeros in binary. If you remember, every 0 is actually 4 zeros. And Bitcoin mining is actually no different than flipping quarters. So let's say you and a friend want to find let's say that every 0 is heads and every 1 is tails. Well, then what's the probability? Does anyone know the probability that you will get 1 head, sorry, does anyone know the probability that a hash you have starts with a 0?
$116, right?
Well, sorry, if we're talking binary.
Oh, okay.
1 out of 2.
1 out of 2, exactly, 50%. Because in binary, a digit can be 0 or 1. And so it's 0. So now imagine it's 2 zeros. What's the probability that a hash starts with 2 zeros.
1 out of 4.
1 out of 4, exactly. So it's no different than flipping heads. If you wanted to flip 1 head in a row, you'd have a 50% chance of doing that. If you wanted to flip 2 heads in a row, you'd have a 25% chance of doing that. So the way Bitcoin mining works is, imagine that you have a bunch of people flipping quarters. So let's start with 1 and say we wanted, it takes 1 person 10 minutes to flip 5 heads in a row. Okay. Now, if you add somebody else to the mix, it'll take 1 person, or it'll take both of them 5 minutes. Even though one of them it takes 1 person 10 minutes, when you add 2 people, it'll take 5 minutes. And so this is exactly what Bitcoin mining is, except instead of coin flipping, you have computing power, which is running through nonces, trying to get outputs that will have a certain number of zeros or heads. So I showed you here, I'm just showing you here the average number of flips it would take to get X amount of heads in a row or zeros in a row. So on average, it would take you 2 flips or 2 hashes to get 1 zero or 1 head. It would take you 30 flips on average to get 4 heads in a row. Now, if we want to talk about Bitcoin and what the network is, when Bitcoin first started, it required hashes that had 32 zeros or 32 heads in a row. Now, this seems like a lot because 8.6 billion flips is probably not practical for a person flipping quarters, but actually quite easy for a standard laptop computer in 2009. And remember before I said, imagine it takes you 5 minutes or 10 minutes to flip 5 heads in a row. Well, that's exactly how the Bitcoin network works. It's programmed so that a block will be processed every 10 minutes. So if more computing power joins the network, as it has since 2009, the protocol will require more zeros to be found because there's more computing power going in, more people flipping coins, and ultimately they want every block to be found after 10 minutes. So today, the most recent block requires 80 heads in a row or 80 zeros in a row, which is the equivalent of you flipping a quarter 1 trillion times, 1 trillion times. So nobody will do that in their lifetime, and it actually takes a whole lot of computing power to achieve that. So if it takes a whole lot of computing power to achieve that, why do it? And that's because of incentives. So if you're a miner, you're putting computing power in to iterate these numbers to ultimately find an output hash that everybody will agree has a certain number of zeros. And why do you do that? That's because if you find that winning hash with a certain number of zeros, in my example, 4 in hex or 16, today's Bitcoin requires 80, you get a Bitcoin reward. And if Bitcoin is worth something, well, then you can either hold that Bitcoin or sell it for some other asset or currency that is valuable to you. So that's it. You understand Bitcoin. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions. There's a few other things I want to talk about kind of since Bitcoin came around. And then I actually don't know when this ends, but I'm happy to stay for however long to answer questions. This is one of my favorite topics. So since Bitcoin, the term blockchain has become very popular. Actually, let me take a brief detour. This is what I was talking about. So in 2009, it required 32 coin flips to find a winning block. And you used to be able to do that on a laptop. Anybody could come and go and join the network with regular hardware. But 13 years later, Bitcoin has become much more of an oligopoly. Only large entities can afford the computing hardware necessary to achieve practically finding a block with 80 zeros or a hash with 80 zeros. And so you see this picture below. This is what's called a mining farm or a warehouse, essentially, that's dedicated solely to iterating nonces to find the next Bitcoin block. Now, a hot topic that I know is on everybody's mind, whether it was before this presentation or now, once I'm talking about all this energy, is saying, but why do we need to use all of this energy? And you see headlines like Bitcoin consumes more electricity than Argentina. It's a growing energy problem. It's a dirty currency. There's better choices from the planet. And so I have a perspective on this, and it's that everything we do, uses energy. From watching Netflix, in fact, streaming video in 2016 was accounted for 1.8% of our energy use. Printing physical money uses 2 billion liters of water every year, just in printing. That's not in growing the cotton and other resources that go into creating money. So things that we use and find valuable require money. So of course, it uses a lot of electricity. But if you think that a currency that is not able to be controlled by a central country, bank, political authority, religious authority, that's essentially decentralized and not controlled by anyone is valuable, then maybe that energy use is worth it. That being said, I'm all about sustainability and improving in the environment or our impacts on the environment. And I think there's ways that we can make Bitcoin more sustainable and more environmentally friendly. So in Norway, they're talking waterfalls. El Salvador, which actually adopted Bitcoin as a national currency last year, is using volcanoes to mine Bitcoin. But whether it's solar power, wind power, or whatever, I think it's important that we focus on ways to make Bitcoin mining and use more sustainable. Additionally, there's other ways to improve, and that's through other currencies. There's a whole ecosystem of other blockchains and cryptocurrencies that you may have heard of, and these all look to innovate or change features from what Bitcoin had. So I mentioned Bitcoin blocks are found every 10 minutes, which means transactions take 10 minutes. So there's a number of protocols here that seek to have faster transactions. I talked about how proof of work, which is Bitcoin's consensus mechanism, or the energy-inducing hashing that I talked about that miners are doing, it uses a lot of energy. So a number of these protocols here are using what's called proof of stake, which is also much lower energy using. Now, there's one major currency that's probably second most well known after Bitcoin, and that's Ethereum. And this was created in 2015 and built on top of the concept of Bitcoin, where you could send money over the internet without a centralized authority. Well, now using Ethereum, you can actually do what's called smart contracts, or build applications on top of the blockchain to do more than just payments. So a traditional contract, I like the sports betting analogy of normally you need a central book in Las Vegas to take your bet, and they take a cut out of each bet that you make. Well, a smart contract would enable you to make a bet with somebody without a central authority, but rather that smart contract on blockchain would enable it automatically. But much more importantly than betting and gambling is the ability to actually create what's called decentralized finance, or DeFi. And that's where you can open financial services, lending, borrowing, and trading of assets beyond currencies without a centralized authority, without credentials, which could open up the world of financial services to more than the privileged people that have access today. So finally, I just want to briefly touch on what Stellar is, because that's the protocol that I work on. So I work at the Stellar Development Foundation, which is a nonprofit that supports the Stellar network. And much like Bitcoin, Stellar is a decentralized open network that connects the world financially. And we seek to work with financial institutions or banks. And so the highest level definition of the difference between Stellar and Bitcoin is we want to be able to share or send value across the internet in the same way Bitcoin does. But instead of using Bitcoin, which is a volatile asset, we actually are issuing coins that are backed by real world assets. So I put a picture here of Stellar USDC, which is the largest asset on the Stellar blockchain. And that is a dollar token. So the value is $1 always. And it's not subject to volatility based on demand of who wants Bitcoin, but rather the value is stable. But you can send it anywhere to anyone in the world who just downloads a wallet. They don't need to have a bank account. They don't need to have a ton of money. They can just accept USDC by downloading a wallet on their mobile phones. I have some resources, which obviously you won't be able to click, but I'm happy to share those with Ellen at the end, including my website and some other things that I thought were either fun, cool, or I like to share. But that's it. So thank you so much. And I'm happy to take questions. And I will stop sharing.
Okay, so if you have a question for Billy, please put it in the chat and I will read it, ask him it for you. You can put from your name, just address it to me. So I'm gonna wait until we get some questions. In the interim, I think I have a little bit better understanding of Bitcoin. I'm gonna have to watch the presentation again to get an even better understanding. But thanks, Billy. This was really, really interesting.
Yes, and I think it's a lot to take in. It's not something you're going to say, "Oh, I'm an expert now." But if every time you learn, you can hear a little bit more and have a slightly better understanding, I think that's the goal. Next time you read an article, you'll have a little bit of better understanding of what they're talking about. And I think right. My personal opinion again is that this is not going anywhere, but rather quite the opposite. It's only going to continue to grow, and it'll become increasingly important in our society. So what that looks like, I don't know, but I think it's important for everybody to understand on some level.
Right. So we have a first question from Daniel Brent. How would an international trade transaction happen with Bitcoin?
So are you talking about like if you wanted to buy something from overseas and wanted to pay in Bitcoin? Is that?
Yeah,
I would. Yeah.
I would a commercial transaction. So instead of having a bank wire money from one company to another, now we're not talking about people on their cell phones.
Right.
But,
yeah, I mean, that's a lot of the work that I'm doing today at Stellar is actually partnering with infrastructure companies. We just actually announced a big partnership with a company called Bit, and we're working with a Ukrainian bank to issue a stable coin. And I know you asked specifically about Bitcoin, but we're building infrastructure that would enable a bank to utilize these currencies in the same way that they use traditional financial institutions today. But the hope is that there's less friction now. So they're able to send money at a lower cost or faster, especially across currencies. So you could imagine that two corporate entities would have Bitcoin wallets, and they may not even know they're using Bitcoin, right? Like it's all in the user interface. You could obfuscate that. But the idea is that they would be able to use these assets in the same way they use traditional financial infrastructure, but with more efficiencies.
Okay. From Reva Levy, what can currently be purchased using Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of websites out there that may accept Bitcoin or not, and some do it, some don't. Tesla for a little while accepted Bitcoin to buy Tesla cars, but that stopped. I think that I talked a lot about the innovation that's come since Bitcoin, and I think Bitcoin, while maybe originally being thought of as a peer-to-peer payment system, has now shifted a little bit to become more of a peer-to-peer storage of value. A lot of people call it digital gold. And something that I left out, which is actually one of the most important things about Bitcoin, is that there's only 21 million. There will never be more than 21 million. So compared to gold, it's truly a hard resource. You can't mine more after a certain point. Once there's 21 million issued, there will never be more. And so people see it as a hedge against inflation, an asset that's a safe place to park your money because no government can control it. There's a number of protocols that are being developed, and especially stable coins, this term of that I said Stellar's working on, where we issue coins that are digital representations of fiat currencies. I think you'll see those being used in the near future for transactions and financial purposes.
Great. From Bonnie Grenis, are transactions anonymous?
Yes. Thanks, Bonnie. So transactions are pseudonymous, which means everything on this blockchain is public. So remember, the miners are grabbing transactions and putting them in blocks. You can go to blockchain.info today, right now, and see every transaction that has ever occurred on Bitcoin. Now, you don't know that it's Bonnie Grenis making the transaction or myself sending it, but you do know that there's a public key, as it's called, that sent a certain amount of Bitcoin to another public key or wallet address. Now, a follow-up question, which a smart listener would ask, is like, so is this traceable? How can the FBI or CIA track funds and prevent fraud and money laundering? And to a certain extent, Bitcoin is actually better for that, because every single thing on the Bitcoin network is traceable. And the only way to go from, or one of the main ways to go from fiat or US dollars to Bitcoin is through licensed regulated exchanges. So if I buy Bitcoin on Coinbase and then send it to another wallet, even if the feds don't know about that other wallet, they know that Billy Grenis bought Bitcoin on Coinbase. This was the wallet he had on Coinbase, and then he sent it to some other wallet. So there's always a track or a history that can be followed. Now, there's ways to hide that, and that's what savvy criminals tried to do, like in the oil pipeline when they asked for Bitcoin as ransom. But there's analytics providers, companies that are data mining the blockchain or just collecting data from the blockchain, and actually were to figure out who the hackers were in that oil pipeline incident, and the FBI was able to seize the funds back.
Great. From Justin Schechtel, how does this connect to NFTs?
Yeah, so Bitcoin is a currency, which is a fungible token. Fungible means one Bitcoin is the same as another Bitcoin. But when Ethereum was launched, and now there's a number of other protocols like it that have created smart contracts, which we discussed earlier, you could actually issue a new token of your own, which is called an NFT or non-fungible token, meaning this token is unique. You know, it's like that unique antique that there's nothing like it. And so NFTs, which is kind of the rage lately, are really just a digital token representation of some sort of asset. And that NFT, that non-fungible token, can tie back to a picture, a painting, a real world physical asset. But the idea is, if you hold that NFT in your wallet, you are the only holder of that asset. Whereas if I hold Bitcoin, Justin could also be holding Bitcoin. If I hold this NFT, I'm the only one in the world that holds this NFT.
From Audrey C, do you see Bitcoin as a hedge for inflation?
It's a good question because I hope it is a hedge against inflation. And I think that's the thesis from a lot of Bitcoiners, especially because there's 21 million, as I said, and there will never be more. Right now, we're seeing that as there's inflation, maybe Bitcoin has become so big that now it's actually reacting to the Fed's moves. So maybe Bitcoin would be a safe place to go because inflation is high in the US. But then the second the Fed threatens to raise interest rates, then people move out of what's called less risky assets like Bitcoin into some of these interest yielding opportunities. So I still do think in the long run, it will be a hedge. But in the short run, there may be some volatility as a result of macroeconomic policies.
Okay, from Alana Broche, can you explain how Billy is covered into the specific string of zeros and ones?
What do you mean covered?
Yeah, Alana, you can unmute and clarify your question.
Sorry, I typed that wrong. I meant converted, and you had that thing with the hexadecimal and then also Billy as zeros and ones. I don't understand how you got Billy into that string.
Yeah. So the zeros and ones to hexadecimal is very easy. You can just use a table. 4 zeros is 1 0, 0 1 0 0 is something else. That's easy. To go from Billy to the hexadecimal, though, is a very convoluted process that you can actually do by hand. And I have a video on here, which you can see how somebody does it. And it has to do with shifting digits and moving things around. It's like an algorithm that computers do. Not so easy to explain, but I do recommend you watch this video of someone doing it by hand. The important thing to notice, it takes somebody hours to do one iteration by hand, and you actually have to do, hundreds or thousands of iterations for each cycle. So it's only something computers can do practically, but it is a process which you should check out this video later.
Thank you.
From Heidi, thank you for explaining the process, but how does one use this process?
The process of mining Bitcoin or sending Bitcoin, what process are we asking about?
Heidi, you can go ahead.
I didn't know anything until you spoke tonight, so thank you for the very beginning foundation, and it was very interesting. But it seems like it's a process that you do all these conversions and whatever for security purposes. And then you get to this mining aggregating function. But okay, so we get to the end of this, and what are we supposed to do with this? Are we supposed to invest in this? Are we supposed to use it? It wasn't clear what we're supposed to do.
Yeah, so as I said, I'm not going to tell you whether or not to invest in Bitcoin. That's for you to decide. I am a Bitcoin believer, but I think everything I showed you is really the behind the scenes of what computers are doing, what wallets are doing, what applications are doing. Much the way that your web browser enables you to go on the internet and you don't know what the hell is actually happening behind the scenes. So I was kind of opening up the door, or the peeling back the onion so you can see why blockchain is so fascinating and amazing and potentially help further the industry. But even if that doesn't interest you, then it doesn't matter. You can still buy Bitcoin, own Bitcoin, send Bitcoin using phone applications, using user-friendly tools where you don't actually need to know any of the things that I just shared with you.
Okay, can I just ask one other question? This 21 million Bitcoins or 21 million whatever, is that an arbitrary number? Like, how come it can't be expanded if there's so much need for it?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, I think it's arbitrary. Satoshi Nakamoto hasn't been seen on the internet since maybe 2010. And that's the entity that created this protocol and decided that number. And so that's why it's 21 million. I'm sure there was some thought behind that, as it's enough to do a certain thing, but it's not too many. Now, why can't it be increased? Because the code is law, and every computer and resource that's on the network agrees that it's 21 million. And if anyone were to try to switch that, none of the other computers would listen to it. So there's very much a network effect where there's not an incentive for any computer to try to change the software because no other computer would listen to them.
Billy, can I interject something that I'm not sure you mentioned and that might help people understand about buying and selling Bitcoin?
I'd love that.
Yeah, so when you buy and sell Bitcoin, you don't necessarily buy a Bitcoin, an entire Bitcoin. Satoshi Nakamoto, when he originally came up with this, came up with another form of currency, consider it sort of the penny, and the Bitcoin is a much larger unit, and those are called Satoshi, and there are 100 million Satoshi per Bitcoin. So if you want to invest $100 or $50 or even $1, you don't buy a Bitcoin, you buy some number of Satoshi. So I don't know what the value of the Bitcoin is at this very moment, but divide that by 100 million, and that's what one Satoshi is worth.
Yeah, no, that's very important. I appreciate that, Ira. And that enabled me to, over the holidays, send $10 worth of Bitcoin to Margie Honickman. But yeah, that's an important concept. And I don't know if Satoshi is the one who named it Satoshis. But at some point, the smallest unit, which Satoshi Nakamoto did decide, did become Satoshis, or sats is the Bitcoin slang. And a lot of like hardcore Bitcoiners, people who believe Bitcoin is the future and the thing, will only talk in sats because they think it's not a good thing to talk in full Bitcoins, because then it discourages people to become a part of it.
So we actually have 25 more questions. I don't know that we'll have time for all of them. We'll do the best we can. From Warren Mitlock, how does the network of miners validate that a transaction is valid?
Yeah, so there's what's called private key and public key. So a public key is the equivalent of your email address, right? It's public to the internet, or at least to your friends. You send me your email address and I can send you an email. But if I don't have your password, there's no way for me to see any other emails. So Bitcoin is the same way with your public key. If you give it to me, I can send you Bitcoin. I have no way to access that without your private key. And your private key is something that you do not want to share with anyone. That's the only way to access Bitcoin that has been sent to you, and that enables you to send Bitcoin from your wallet to others. In practice, you can have your private key managed by a company like Coinbase, where you would just have a password that allows you access to this private key where you can send Bitcoin, or you can have a hardware device or a piece of paper where you write down the private key. And you store that in a safe and control kind of the custody of your Bitcoins.
Okay, so from Ephraim, so at the outset, most people with a computer could be a miner. Can this still happen with all the computing power necessary to become a miner?
Yeah, and that's something that's talked a lot about in the Bitcoin community too, because it's like, in an ideal world, anybody could become a miner and contribute to the network and earn rewards. In practice, it has become an oligopoly, or mostly only major entities can have the computing power or be able to afford the computers required to do this. There is enough data out there to show that it's kind of still distributed enough to be distributed ledger where there's not any entity with too much control or computing power to control the network. And I did see today, actually, there was somebody with like one miner that was able to mine a Bitcoin, but that kind of thing was like big news in the Bitcoin world, of course, not CNN big, because it's not really practical anymore.
We have a question from Reva again. What can currently be purchased using Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I answered that. I don't really know. Some websites may accept it. If your friend wants to accept Bitcoin and pay you and hand you a car, then you can use Bitcoin to make purchases. I think more people are seeing Bitcoin as a store of value because of its limited supply and a better gold. And other currencies are now focusing more on the payments use case, like Stellar.
Okay, so from Ira, given that some of the newer virtual currencies do not have the same limitations and problems found with Bitcoin, why should Bitcoin persist long-term, as you mentioned?
There's this interesting law or concept. It's called the Lindy effect. And it essentially states that the longer something's in existence, the longer it's likely to exist. And so Bitcoin, as the first cryptocurrency and the longest standing, and one that's never been hacked, one that's never been broken, with every year, every moment that it exists, it's more likely to exist. So while it's no guarantee, every day that Bitcoin's still around, and it to me is more likely to survive, and according to that effect, it is. That doesn't mean that other currencies, protocols can't exist for different purposes and different use cases, right? I work for the Stellar blockchain, so I still hold Bitcoin, I still believe in it, but I also believe in Stellar. And the truth is nobody knows, but the properties of Bitcoin, like its limited supply, as the price grows too, it becomes more valuable, more people want to hold it. So that's my perspective, and we can talk offline more about that, Ira.
Let's see. From Randy Brett. Specie or money is a stand-in for a tangible asset. For example, dollars were at one time redeemable in gold or silver. Now it is the full faith and credit of the United States. What backs up Bitcoin? How can the value be determined?
Yeah, well, I don't know how the value can be determined. I guess it's supply and demand, but I think that's exactly the thing to think about. And we live in a world where we've trusted governments to give value in currency. And in the US, we've been lucky that our dollar has been relatively stable. I do worry about the amount of spending and not paying off our debt, but still fortunate to be in the US. That's not the case in many other countries. Argentina has 50% inflation each year. But at the end of the day, really its value is dictated by what people believe. Like in the same way gold has value, I mean, gold is so impractical, and sure, maybe a little bit of it is used for jewelry, but most of it is sitting in these large blocks in the basement of a building in Kentucky, doing nothing. And why does that have value? Just because people say it has value, and people have said it has value for thousands of years. And so, Bitcoin's way newer, and so kind of less Lindy effect maybe than gold. But I think the difference today is that with technology adoption and things are growing much quicker. So I think an ethos or a belief in Bitcoin, with modern technology can grow and be very Lindy, if you will, quicker than other assets.
As I said, we have about 34 more questions, and unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get to all of them. So before I give a few more, is there a way people could contact you with their questions? I know that there are a lot of them, so.
Yeah, so I'm more than happy to answer any questions. I'll put my email in here, and anybody can shoot me an email. I love to chat about this, even if I answered your question. Maybe you want to chat more. But yeah, I'm happy to take the last couple or whatever you think.
Okay, yeah. So I see, where do you see the price of Bitcoin by the end of 2022?
Either higher or lower than it is today. But I hope higher, but I dollar cost average. So I buy a little bit of Bitcoin every single day. If it goes down, I get more. If it goes up, I have more.
Okay, let's see. Trying to get a little, some of them are duplicated, so I'm gonna go through. There's a question a couple of questions about what makes the price of Bitcoin so volatile. I don't remember if I asked you that before or not, but.
Yeah, I think Bitcoin is still trying to find its like appropriate supply and demand. It's still a new technology. People are still hearing about it or learning about it for the first time. Perhaps people will buy it after this for the first time or sell it. So like, oh, now that I know what this is, I don't want it. But I think there's just still a lot of price exploration, and we haven't found its true value yet. And of course, macroeconomics, in the same way stocks are volatile, not just because of business changes, but because of the changing landscape of the world and the financial system and Federal Reserve and other governments' policies, prices fluctuate. So I think it's a whole combination of macro effects and still figuring out supply and demand.
From Bernie and Judy Flightman, who licenses or regulates these exchanges? What entity?
There's a number of regulatory bodies that are trying to figure out how to regulate and what regulations there should be, because different cryptocurrencies actually have different properties. And so where one cryptocurrency could be treated as a currency, like a stable coin, because the price isn't volatile. Another would be considered like real estate, like Bitcoin, I think right now is treated as real estate. Whereas another might be a token of value or ownership, and then it's treated as like an equity or asset like that. And so there's a whole number of regulatory bodies that are regulating these: the CFTC, the Federal Reserve, the SEC, and it's a very muggy landscape. But I think if you're a lawyer, it's probably a very exciting place to try to figure all of that out.
From Dennis Alba, can you give a short explanation of how buying Bitcoin can be a good investment?
Feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to chat about my investment strategies.
Oh, here, let me see if I have, let's see. Can anybody create a crypto?
Yes. In fact, it's actually quite easy on Stellar. We have a Stellar Laboratory website which walks you through how to issue an asset, and you could do it in minutes. And there's how or why certain things get adopted or not, and what their properties are. Well, that's a different story. But anybody can issue a crypto or an NFT actually fairly easily now.
So Peter Smith says that one Bitcoin is worth around $40,000 today.
Yes, up a little bit today as well. It hit 69,000 was the highest I saw. It never hit 70.
Okay. This is an interesting one. If I want to exchange Bitcoin for paper cash, is there an exchange rate through a bank for that transaction?
Some banks are starting to offer Bitcoin through a company called NYDIG, NYDIG. And that will be easier, but right now you can still do it with Coinbase. You can connect your bank account to Coinbase, sell Bitcoin, and have your funds in your bank account, going through ACH or wire, whatever the local rails are. To get to physical cash, I'm happy to meet you outside the Jewish Center and send you Bitcoin for cash, or vice versa.
Okay, this is a question from Rabbi Mero. Are shuls or nonprofits accepting Bitcoin as donations? Would you know?
They definitely should be, if there's appetite. I think the question of whether you keep it in Bitcoin or other digital assets is a question for you to think about as the finances of the Jewish Center or other nonprofits. There's plenty of companies that will actually just for a small fee or a percentage fee convert Bitcoin for dollars. I will say that Tesla and a growing number of companies, some public, mostly private, are adding Bitcoin to their treasuries. Instead of just holding all cash, they're actually holding some Bitcoin.
Okay, so I think I actually got to just about every question. A lot of them were duplicates, but thank you for putting your email in so people can continue asking questions. And I have a number of comments, which you're probably seeing, saying, thank you, Billy, fantastic presentation.
Well, my pleasure.
It was really wonderful. It was great to see you. I really appreciate this. I think I actually do understand a little bit more about Bitcoin now, as I'm sure others do. I thank you so much. And I just want to tell whoever's still on that our next Great Minds Salon will be at the end of February, and it will be Eleni Litt, and she's going to speak about how an artist interprets the Talmud through art. So look forward to that one. And hopefully everyone perhaps who is available will be at Shul on Shabbat. We're gonna honor Martin Luther King Jr. and have some speakers. Thank you again, Billy. I keep getting messages about this excellent presentation. And
Awesome.
It was great to see you.
Yeah, I just want to say Ellen is one of my oldest Hebrew school teachers. This has been a pleasure. And
yeah, I'm not even sure I know exactly how long ago you were a student, but
20 or more years ago.
No,
maybe.
at least.
But anyways, thank you so much to everyone. As I said, feel free to reach out to me. I love talking about this. And hopefully
we can tell.
I taught you a little bit more about Bitcoin.
Absolutely.
And
so I'm going to stop the recording for a minute and